Tonight, somewhere in Manhattan, someone will pay more than $100 for this plate. 300 years ago, that same sea creature was considered so worthless that it was fed to prisoners, servants, and slaves. This is the story almost always told about the lobster, its journey from garbage to luxury. And it's true, but there's one detail in this story that people love to boast about most. And that very detail, as it turns out, is hard to back up with a single document. Today, two stories at once. How the lobster actually transformed from poor man's food into a status symbol, and how a small legend of its own grew up inside that true story. When the first European settlers landed in New England, there were so many lobsters that after storms they literally covered the shore in layers up to 2 feet deep. Plymouth Colony Governor William Bradford wrote with embarrassment in 1622 that the only thing the colony could offer newcomers was lobster and water, with no bread or anything else. Native peoples of the coast used lobster as fertilizer for corn and as fishing bait, not as a delicacy. For the colonists, lobster quickly earned a reputation as poor man's food. Its cheapness and abundance made it the standard ration for those society valued least: prisoners, indentured servants, apprentices, and slaves. Having a pile of lobster shells by your house was considered a sign of poverty, a phrase recorded as far back as 1876 by writer John Rowan. Lobster was even nicknamed the cockroach of the sea because of its outward resemblance to the insect, and because so few people wanted to eat it if they could afford anything else. The word lobster itself comes from the Old English lopa, meaning spider. Even the name carries a hint of something better avoided at the table, given a choice. And now, the most popular detail in this story, the one repeated in almost every article about lobster. The story goes that indentured servants in colonial Massachusetts, or in another version, Virginia, rebelled against being fed lobster every day and won a clause written into their contracts: lobster no more than 2 or 3 times a week. This story sounds perfect. It turns an abstract reputation as poor man's food into a concrete, almost comic scene of rebellion. The problem is that when historians tried to find the original source for this specific detail, a real contract, a real petition, a real law, they couldn't find one. Boston colonial history researcher J.L. Bell combed the archives and concluded there is no documentary evidence for this particular clause. Likewise, a review of Massachusetts state archives conducted by the MIT Sea Grant program found no act, petition, or law confirming it. This doesn't mean lobster didn't have a poor reputation. That's independently and repeatedly documented. But this vivid detail about a servant's rebellion most likely emerged much later as an artistic embellishment of a true but less cinematic story. Even the story of poor people's food has its own marketing. The real turning point wasn't a single moment. It was a technology: transportation. In 1842, the first lobster cannery opened in Maine. Canning solved the main problem: how to get lobster to places it had never reached alive before. Interestingly, at first, the canneries considered 4- and 5-pound lobsters too small to process. Only later, as large lobsters became scarcer, did canneries start working with much smaller ones. Around the same time, so-called smack boats appeared, vessels with special holds through which seawater circulated, allowing live lobsters to be transported over long distances. Then came the railroads. As transcontinental trains began crossing the country, railroad companies noticed something interesting. Passengers inland had never heard that lobster was considered poor people's food back on the coast. To them, it was an exotic, almost luxurious delicacy, and it cost the railroad next to nothing. In the dining cars, lobster was served alongside game and champagne. Passengers loved it. They started seeking out the dish even after leaving the train. By the 1850s to 60s, lobster appeared on New York restaurant menus, and by the end of the century, so-called lobster palaces emerged. Lavish establishments where dishes like lobster Newburg were served to high society. People who had never seen a mountain of shells on a beach simply were never told they were supposed to be embarrassed by it. During World War II, lobster, unlike beef and other goods, was not rationed. So while meat was distributed by ration coupons, Americans of every income level started trying lobster and discovering its taste. By the 1950s, its status as a delicacy was firmly established. Movie stars ate lobster. It appeared at the weddings of wealthy families. Today, on a restaurant menu, it's typically priced as Market price. A line that signals this is no ordinary dish. In less than a century, lobster went from a food people were ashamed to serve guests to a dish whose price on the menu isn't even spelled out directly. So why does a plate of lobster cost $100? Unlike corn, wheat, or beef, lobster prices aren't regulated by government support programs. They depend entirely on how much fishing boats actually catch in a season. That means prices can jump 18% in a single year, as happened in 2012. Wholesale prices fluctuate between roughly $8 and $14 a pound, depending on the season. But the restaurant price isn't just the cost of the meat. Live lobster has to be transported in cold water, often by plane. With the arrival of jet air travel in the 1960s, lobster from the Maine coast could for the first time fly live to Tokyo or London the same day it was caught. Logistics, the product's fragility, and status all combine to shape the price tag. The restaurant isn't just selling protein, it's selling a century-old story about scarcity and prestige, one it maintains itself. And there's another wrinkle. The lobster is a fragile creature. It spoils quickly after death, so chefs cook it live. And in the tanks of shops and restaurants, lobster claws are banded with rubber bands. Packed tightly together, they behave cannibalistically and can maim one another. This logistics of a living creature, rather than simply a frozen product, is another reason the price stays high. Losses during transport are baked into every price tag. But it looks like the pendulum may be swinging back again. Maine's lobster catch, the state that supplies most of the lobster in the U.S., has fallen from more than 132 million pounds in 2016 to roughly 93 to 94 million pounds in 2023 to 2024. One reason is that the Gulf of Maine is warming faster than most of the world's oceans, and lobsters are moving deeper and farther out, making them more expensive to catch. The industry's value, which topped $900 million in 2021, has dropped to roughly $450 million. At the same time, a fierce dispute continues over rules to protect the North Atlantic right whale, a species with fewer than 400 individuals left. NOAA is demanding new restrictions from Maine fishermen, gear marking, fewer vertical lines, seasonal closures of entire sections of the Gulf. Fishermen's associations argue their gear almost never comes into contact with whales. Conservationists insist that even isolated entanglements are lethal for a species with so few individuals remaining. In the summer of 2025, Congress discussed extending a moratorium on new rules until 2035, a dispute that remains unresolved. On top of that, in 2024 to 2025, regulators tried to introduce another rule, raising the minimum legal size for lobsters that can be caught, since the juvenile population in the Gulf of Maine is estimated to have declined by more than 35%. Fishermen opposed it, fearing that even a small size change would deal a blow to an already weakened industry, and implementation of the rule was postponed twice in a row. In other words, a delicacy once too cheap to be valued may now become too rare to be caught the way it used to be. A food's status is almost never determined by its taste or nutritional value. It's determined by who can get it, how easily it can be transported, and what story gets told about it. The lobster hasn't changed over the past 400 years. What changed was who could get it to you alive, who could afford it, and who decided it was prestigious. And the same logic applies today. If ocean warming and regulatory battles keep shrinking the catch, the price could climb even higher. Or if the industry can't withstand the pressure, the delicacy we know might start to disappear in a completely different way. Lobster won't hurt you, but next time you see it on a $100 plate, remember, that price isn't about the product itself. It's about a century-long story of rebranding, and about how easily a true story gets overgrown with details that, in the end, nobody could actually verify. If this video changed how you'll look at lobster on a menu, leave a like, and tell us in the comments, what food legend have you heard so often you never once doubted it?